"Don't touch that piano, old man." When a mysterious drifter dares to play a broken piano in a forgotten nursing home, a nurse tries to shut him down. But no one realizes this man is an undercover billionaire. And what he plays next doesn't just shock the room, it changes everything. Watch what unfolds when music reawakens memory, and a community long silenced rises in a way no one could have predicted. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. "Don't touch that piano, old man." The words cracked through the stale air like a whip, drawing every eye in the common room to the source, an elderly man in a faded hoodie, his back-hunched fingers hovering just above the chipped ivory keys of a forgotten upright piano. The nurse's voice, sharp, dismissive, wasn't just a warning. It was a verdict. And in this place, verdicts came without trials. The man didn't flinch. He stood still, a silhouette outlined by the dust-filled sunlight streaming through slanted blinds. One hand rested gently on the worn edge of the piano, the other curled near the keys, like it remembered a shape the rest of the world had forgotten. His face was hard to see under the hoodie, but the deep lines around his mouth suggested years of silence, and maybe, just maybe, a song held hostage behind his ribs. "I said," the nurse repeated louder this time, "it's not a toy. We don't need any racket in here." He blinked slowly, then turned. What if it remembers how to sing? A few residents chuckled softly. Others just stared, unsure whether to be amused or alarmed. The piano, tucked in the corner under an old painting of a winter landscape, hadn't made music in years. Not since the previous activities director passed away. Now it was more relic than instrument, a piece of scenery. "Let him be," murmured a voice from across the room. It came from a woman slumped in a wheelchair near the window, her hair a silver waterfall, her expression distant, but not empty. Her name was Miriam. She rarely spoke. Most staff had stopped trying to engage with her months ago. The nurse gave her a tight smile and turned back to the man. "Look, we've got a schedule. Bingo in 10. You want to tinker, go fiddle with a puzzle." But he wasn't listening anymore. His fingers, gnarled, trembling, slow descended toward the keys. One note. Just one. It was a D. Flat. The sound rang out warped, stretched, thin like a breath through cracked glass, and yet something in the tone shimmered. Not the note itself, but the intention. Like it was calling to something. Buried. A hush fell over the room. The nurse exhaled through her nose. "Suit yourself. Just don't wake the ones who still sleep." She left with a final snap of her clipboard. But the moment had already changed. The man sat. Slowly. Tenderly. As if lowering himself into a confessional booth. He adjusted his sleeves, stretched his fingers, and then ran a soft arpeggio across the keys, most of which responded like drunkards trying to stand. He smiled faintly. Broken didn't mean silent. Not here. Not yet. The clock ticked. Residents shifted. But Miriam didn't blink. Her eyes, stormy with age, locked on the man. Something behind them stirred. Not recognition. Something older than memory. He played nothing recognizable. Just fragments, half-formed melodies, tones hanging like forgotten words. A lullaby drowned beneath time. The sound wasn't pretty, but it meant something, like the piano was confessing too. And then it ended, just as suddenly as it had begun. He stood, wincing slightly, and gave the instrument a soft pat. "You're still in there," he whispered to it. Someone clapped, just once, then again. Soon a few of the residents were applauding, not because they understood the song, but because they felt it. The room moments before stifled in silence and routine now breathed. Later, when he shuffled back to his shared room down the linoleum hallway, he kept his head down. A staff member asked if he'd gotten lost. He mumbled a non-answer. Everyone assumed he was new. No one recognized him. Why would they? The beard, the hood, the borrowed cane, all intentional, carefully constructed. But beneath that disguise was Thomas Grayson. The Thomas Grayson, the man whose tech empire once rivaled Apple, who had disappeared from public view a decade earlier after selling off his shares, donating half to anonymous charities, and vanishing without so much as a final interview. He had stepped off the map and into silence, until now. Now he wandered sterile hallways where wheelchairs whispered and televisions played the same loop of morning talk shows. Now he existed in a world where names faded faster than memories and dignity decayed faster than the wallpaper. But he wasn't here to be found. He was here to feel again. In his modest room, nothing more than a cot, a table, and a narrow window facing a brick wall, he pulled out a worn manila folder from his bag. Inside, old sheet music, some of it decades old. His, some of it not. The topmost piece was scrawled in faded pencil, labeled Miriam's Melody, unfinished. He stared at it. He didn't know Miriam yet, but something told him she'd once lived inside music too. That night the halls went still. The residents tucked in. The night nurse, young, sweet, bored, nodded off to a soap opera rerun. Thomas slipped down the west hallway and into the storage room. He flicked on the dim light. Shadows danced across stacked wheelchairs and plastic bins, but in one corner behind a broken humidifier sat what he was looking for. An old piano bench, cracked but solid, and a toolkit. He pulled it open slowly, fingers trembling not from age but from anticipation. It had been years since he'd tuned a piano, years since he'd needed to. In his previous life, he paid others to handle it. Now, with no one watching, he lifted the lid of the piano back in the common room and examined its guts like a doctor returning to a sacred craft. Several hammers were misaligned. A handful of strings were snapped. The pedals barely moved, but it wasn't dead. Not yet. He whispered to it, a ritual of sorts. Let's find your voice again. He worked in silence, pausing only to listen, to test, to feel. A few of the wires snapped back into place. A loose pin tightened. One by one, the elements began to respond. By the time he returned to his room, dawn was teasing the horizon. His hands were sore, his back ached, but his eyes were alive. The next morning, breakfast was served with oatmeal, weak coffee, and gossip. The man who played yesterday, what was his name? No one knew. But the piano. It had sounded different, fuller, like it had cleared its throat. In the corner, Miriam stared at her plate. Her lips trembled. Thomas sat alone, watching the sunlight crawl across the floor. He knew something had begun, and he knew it couldn't be undone. Not now. Not after that single imperfect note had cracked open something he thought he'd buried forever. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and powdered eggs. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a dull chorus of mechanical cicadas, casting long shadows across the faded linoleum floors. Thomas moved slowly, not just from age, but from calculation. Every shuffle of his feet, every slight wince was performed with the precision of someone who'd studied invisibility. He passed a room with an open door. Inside, a man in his 90s was trying to lift a dumbbell with both hands. His arms shook like paper in wind. "We all fight something," Thomas murmured, pausing to watch. No one noticed. No one ever really did. That suited him just fine. He stopped by the window at the end of the hall, the one no one seemed to use. Outside, a robin tugged a worm from dry dirt near a crooked bench. Beyond it, the chain-link fence that marked the end of the property line curled inward, as if ashamed to be there. Beyond that, just silence. Suburbia's forgotten pocket. Thomas slid down the wall to sit. And for the first time in over a decade, he let the silence sit with him. Not as a punishment, but as company. Once his world had been boardrooms, stock tickers, keynote stages, interviews that dissected his genius and chased his fortune. They called him the Mozart of code back then. They praised how he could build empires with algorithms and break markets with nothing but a glance at a dashboard. He was the man who sold Grayson Technologies at its peak and walked away with billions. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered were the whispers, the ones no one else seemed to hear, the notes left unfinished, the questions he never answered. He had disappeared not out of spite, but out of exhaustion. He had conquered every mountain society built for men like him. And in doing so, he lost the very music that used to dance in his chest like wildfire. Until yesterday. One cracked piano string, one forgotten key, one moment that felt like breathing after being underwater too long. He stood up and continued down the hallway. Outside the activities room, he paused. Laughter. Laughter. That sound had been absent since he arrived. He opened the door quietly and stepped inside. The same upright piano sat in the corner. Dust still lingered across its frame, but the air around it had changed. A cluster of residents sat nearby, not crowded but present. Some knitting, others reading, but their chairs had turned slightly toward the instrument. Waiting. Thomas didn't go to the piano, not yet. Instead, he scanned the shelves lining the walls. He was searching for something specific. Books, games, coloring sheets. And there it was. A rusted metal basket stuffed with sheet music, mostly torn, most yellowed with age, some handwritten in cursive. He pulled one out at random. Bach, another Debussy, then another soft parchment nearly brittle. Summer Waltz, he read aloud, composed by Miriam H. Linley. His breath caught. Linley. That name was on the clipboard outside the wheelchair woman's room. Miriam. He turned slowly, eyes seeking her. She was in the same chair by the same window, her hands folded neatly in her lap like always. Her eyes were open, but she was staring inward, into rooms no one could visit. Thomas approached. He knelt beside her gently, knees popping in protest. Miriam, he said softly, holding out the page. Is this yours? No response. He studied her closer. Her face was beautiful in that quiet, time-worn way, like a photograph weathered by love and sunlight. Her eyes didn't move, but her fingers did, barely. A twitch, the smallest motion, but it was toward the page. He looked back down. The first few measures were clean, elegant. The waltz started in A minor, but something in the phrasing turned it upward, as if refusing to stay in sadness. The last lines of the composition were missing, simply blank. Finished, forgotten. He stood up and carried the page to the piano. The chair creaked under him as he sat. The room settled. Conversations faded. Eyes turned. He didn't speak. He played. Soft, careful, slow, like brushing dust off a memory. The melody unfolded with gentleness, flowing like silk down old walls. The piano still stumbled keys, rattling in places, but the soul of the piece bled through. Each note leaned into the next like a story being whispered in real time. And when he reached the blank part, the room held its breath. He didn't stop. He improvised. He listened to what the notes wanted to say. He wove something honest, not flashy, not technical, just true. When the last note drifted away, no one clapped. They couldn't. Most were holding something in their chests that couldn't be released with sound. Then came the smallest voice from across the room. Again, Miriam whispered. Not loud, not desperate, just certain. Every head turned. The nurse on duty dropped her clipboard. One man gasped audibly. Another woman began to cry. Thomas nodded once and played it again. This time her lips moved in sync with the melody. Not singing, but following. Her hands trembled slightly on her lap. He watched her as he played. When the song ended, she looked up, right at him, and smiled. Just a crack, but unmistakable. He felt it in his chest like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. Later, as the residents filed out for lunch, murmuring to one another in tones that hadn't existed just days ago, Thomas stayed behind. He removed the back panel of the piano again. He had more work to do. The soft hammer for E4 was still misaligned. The damper pedal needed shimming. He made mental notes. He didn't notice the nurse standing nearby until she spoke. "That woman hasn't said a word in almost 3 years," she whispered. "Not one." He didn't answer. "I don't know who you are," she continued, "but you're doing something none of us have managed." He closed the lid, turned to her. "I'm just listening," he said. She nodded slowly. Then, almost under her breath, "I think the piano's listening too." That night, in the quiet of his room, Thomas pulled out a leather-bound notebook. He turned past pages of scratched-out code, unfinished business plans, half-written apologies. He wrote at the top of a fresh page, "Miriam's Waltz, complete." And then beneath it, "Not all things that are broken are finished." He capped the pen, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. He felt placed, as if the universe in its quiet orchestration had dropped him right where he needed to be. A paper napkin folded 3 times lay beside Miriam's tray at breakfast. No one knew who placed it there. It hadn't come from the food staff who always served meals with institutional indifference. It hadn't come from the nurse who sighed her way through refills. It just appeared, folded with care. Soft handwriting on the inside in fading pencil. "Why did you stop writing music?" It was unsigned. Miriam stared at it unmoving as a spoon of oatmeal cooled in front of her. Her daughter Evelyn, sitting beside her as usual, looked up from her phone and blinked. "Mom, is this from you?" Miriam didn't speak, but her fingers brushed the note once, a small, deliberate motion. Evelyn leaned in her voice suddenly gentle. "Mom, do you know this handwriting?" No reply, only a single blink. But the napkin didn't leave her fingers. Later that morning, Thomas sat on the back patio beneath a weathered pergola, his notebook balanced on one knee, a coffee cup steaming beside him. The sun filtered through the slats, cutting the world into stripes of light and shadow. He was sketching, not words, notes. He wrote like a man remembering a language he hadn't spoken aloud in years. He didn't hear the soft wheels of a nurse's cart until she cleared her throat beside him. "I saw you yesterday," she said. Thomas looked up. It was the young night nurse, the only one who didn't seem to resent being here. "You made her smile," she continued, her voice quiet. "Miriam. She hasn't smiled in... I honestly didn't think she still could." Thomas nodded once, keeping his gaze on the sheet music. "I used to teach music," she added, "before nursing. It's funny how things circle back, isn't it?" He closed the notebook. "Not funny," he said softly. "Necessary." The nurse hesitated. "She was a legend around here, you know. Taught at the university. Used to play 4 instruments. Wrote pieces for local symphonies. Even toured. That piano you're fixing, they brought it in for her." "What happened?" "Her husband died. She got sick. The music just stopped. A beat passed. Sometimes I think that's when people really get old, not when their body fails, but when their sound disappears." Thomas let that sit between them like incense. Then he asked, "Do you think she still hears it?" The nurse smiled. "Yesterday I know she does." When the nurse left, Thomas retrieved a different page from his bag. A letter. Unfolded, the edges curled from years of wear. A reply he'd written long ago but never sent, addressed to no one, or maybe everyone. He read the first line to himself. "I stopped performing because applause became louder than the music." He tucked it back inside and stood cane in hand, heading down the hallway toward the common room. The piano greeted him with silence and expectation. He placed Miriam's half-finished summer waltz on the stand and opened his notebook beside it. A new melody had taken shape overnight, simple, yet with that aching space between notes that left room for breath, room for memory. As he pressed the first chord, the hallway lights flickered, once soft, not ominous, but like the building itself was listening. A slow glissando up the scale, then a pause. The door creaked open. Evelyn wheeled Miriam inside her expression somewhere between skepticism and wonder. "She insisted," Evelyn said. "She hasn't insisted on anything since 2018. Thomas smiled without showing teeth. "Then let's not waste it." The room had no audience, just the three of them. But when Thomas began to play, it didn't feel empty. It felt like church. The melody shifted through delicate changes, bending into harmony, then pulling back into solitude. Miriam's eyes never left the piano. Her hands rested still except one thumb which tapped softly against the armrest. Evelyn covered her mouth as tears gathered in her eyes. When the final note faded, Thomas stayed at the keys unmoving. Then Miriam's voice rose, gravelly, fragile, but clear. "I was afraid if I played again, I'd remember everything I lost." Silence crashed into the room. Evelyn gasped aloud. "Mom!" Miriam turned her head slowly and looked at her daughter with full awareness. "He's playing my music," she said. "I wrote that a long time ago, before I stopped." Evelyn dropped to her knees beside her mother, stunned into stillness. "You remember?" Miriam gave the smallest nod. "Not everything, but enough." Thomas didn't speak. He simply lowered his head and pressed his hand against the frame of the piano like a man thanking something sacred. That evening the residents talked. They whispered in the hallways over mashed potatoes and gelatin desserts. A nurse had to remind one table twice that dinner was over. A retired nurse named Gloria said she hadn't seen this kind of light in the building since the Christmas choir came, 6 years ago. The next morning a paper flower appeared on the piano lid, folded perfectly, pink. Then a thank you note scribbled in shaky handwriting signed only Earl Arm 107. Then a pair of slippers with embroidered eighth notes. No one knew where they came from. But one thing was certain. Something had changed. Thomas began writing again. He woke early even before the breakfast carts to catch the way the sun moved through the windows. He watched the other residents, how they carried grief like a second coat, how their eyes dimmed not from age, but from being unseen. And he composed with them in mind. He wrote a piece for Helen the widow who always wore pearls but never spoke. He titled it Waltz for One. He wrote a lullaby for Earl, the man with war medals and trembling hands who hadn't slept through a night in 20 years. And he wrote something bold and sweeping for Miriam. He didn't show her yet. Not until it was ready. One afternoon, a janitor caught him removing the back of the piano again. "You fixing it?" "Trying to," Thomas replied, brushing dust off the felts. The janitor looked curious. "You a musician or something?" Thomas hesitated, then smiled. "Something." The janitor laughed. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. That old box never sounded so sweet." That night, a nurse found Miriam asleep in her wheelchair, a pencil in her lap. In front of her, a paper napkin filled with notations, half chords, lyrics, a melody line. She didn't need help to be wheeled to her room. She pushed herself. When Thomas heard about it, he stepped outside into the garden and looked up at the stars. The air smelled like rain and old roses. He reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. Still turned off, still untouched. He powered it on. A flurry of notifications exploded on the screen. Years of unopened messages, missed calls, articles speculating his disappearance, business deals lost in his absence. And one text. Recent. From Lena, his daughter. "Saw a video of a man playing in a nursing home. Looked like you. If it is, just say hi." He stared at the message for a long time, then typed, "Hi," and hit send. The morning began with light tapping against the window's spring rain, the gentle kind that made time feel suspended, like the world itself had exhaled. Inside the common room, it smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked soil tracked in from nurse shoes. The piano sat waiting, upright, dust-free, as if aware that something larger than music had begun stirring within its ribs. Thomas entered without a word. He moved slowly, but with presence now, not seeking attention, only connection. The residents no longer stared with confusion. They looked forward to him. His arrival meant something was about to change, even if for only a moment. This time, as he sat at the piano, the bench had been polished. A folded note waited on the keys. "Play that thing you played for Miriam. Please, I need it." Rum 214. He smiled, heart tugging gently in his chest. He placed his fingers over the keys and began. The waltz. It was different now, fuller. The piano was still imperfect. Some hammers weak, one or two notes refusing to hold, but the soul of the instrument had come alive. It responded to him not like a tool, but like a partner. Each note gave back. Each pause meant something. By the second chorus, residents had gathered. A few shuffled into chairs nearby, others watched from doorways. Miriam sat upright in her wheelchair, eyes closed, her fingers moving as if conducting invisible air. And then, without warning, a harmony joined in. A low, gravel-voiced hum from Earl, then a gentle humming from Helen. Then more. Not words, just resonance. Thomas kept playing, but tears rimmed his eyes. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was communion. At the edge of the room, a staff member filmed quietly on her phone, unable to help herself. She wasn't thinking of followers or views. She simply didn't want this moment to disappear. She titled the video, "The Piano Whisperer at Golden Hills Nursing Home," then uploaded it, and went back to listening. That evening, the sky cracked open with thunder. Rain turned heavy. The smell of petrichor swept through open windows and hallways. Thomas stayed up late, scribbling new melodies with a bedside lamp, the thunderstorm outside mirroring the music in his head. Meanwhile, the video did what music always does when it's honest. It moved. A few dozen views turned into a few hundred by morning. Comments poured in. "This made me cry. That's not just playing. That's healing. Anyone else think this guy looks like Thomas Grayson?" One comment lingered longer than the rest. "My grandma's in that home. She says the man fixed more than the piano." By noon, the video had reached 50,000 views. A retired jazz pianist in New Orleans reposted it, then a music therapy foundation, then a viral news page, and then it landed in Lena Grayson's inbox. She opened it while waiting for her coffee order at a busy Manhattan cafe. She hadn't heard from her father in over a decade, not since he vanished without goodbye. But last night she'd received a one-word text, "Hi." No punctuation, no explanation. She stared at it for hours. Now she pressed play. She recognized the posture first, the way he sat at the bench, not like a man seeking applause, but like a man asking for forgiveness without words. Then his hands. Her coffee grew cold. She watched as elderly residents began humming along, their eyes bright with something she hadn't seen in her own since she was a child, watching him play in their living room. She didn't cry. She just sat, perfectly still. Then she forwarded the video to a contact in the press with a single line, "This is my father. He's alive. Please, don't ruin this." Back at Golden Hills, Thomas felt none of it. He had no idea a storm had begun to gather beyond the walls, one of cameras and headlines and speculation. All he knew was that Miriam had started writing again. That evening, she wheeled herself toward him with a small notepad in her lap. "I remembered an ending," she said softly, "to Summer Waltz. It came back in a dream." She handed him the page scrawled in shaky pencil but clear. He studied it, then looked at her. "It's perfect." She smiled. "Not perfect, just honest." He began transcribing it that night, matching her final measures to his own improvised middle. The piece felt whole now, like a long-lost letter finally mailed. He called it Waltz for the Forgotten. The next day, the director of the home returned from vacation. Her heels clicked loudly through the hallway as she made her way to her office where a stack of emails waited. The top one was from corporate. Subject line, urgent, reviral video from your facility. She clicked, then read. Her eyebrows rose higher with every sentence. She played the video, jaw tightening as the piano played. She recognized the man immediately. Thomas Grayson, the former tech mogul who once donated $200 million to Alzheimer's research. She had seen him once at a gala. What the hell was he doing here? She summoned her assistant. I want a full report on this Mr. Gray in room 3B, his records, intake forms, everything. That afternoon, a nurse found Thomas by the west window watching the rain. Did you know you're famous now? She asked, half teasing, half awestruck. He turned. Fame's a heavy coat. I left it behind. Well, she said, handing him a tablet. It found you anyway. He scrolled slowly. His face remained calm. But when he saw the thumbnail, his hands on the keys, Miriam smiling behind him, his heart faltered. He thought he'd buried that version of himself. But the world was digging. Still, he wasn't afraid. He was only afraid of what would happen to this place, this sanctuary, this fragile revival, once the outside world came storming in with cameras and assumptions. He had one day, maybe two, and he intended to use them. That night he brought out the repaired sustain pedal, the final piece. He waited until everyone had settled into the common room. Then he sat at the piano and placed the finished sheet music on the stand. Miriam was beside him, Evelyn holding her hand. Other residents hushed one another. He looked at them all, and then said, "This piece is not for critics. It's not for charts or headlines. It's for memory, for the parts of us we thought were lost." He began, and this time the piano sang. The room dissolved into melody and warmth. The storm outside softened. Miriam hummed softly, then closed her eyes and let tears run freely down her cheeks. And somewhere in another state, a concert pianist paused rehearsal to watch the same video live. Somewhere else, a child watched and asked her mother what a waltz was. And in a boardroom in Silicon Valley, a group of billionaires stared at the screen and said nothing at all, because in the end the sound of a broken piano played by a forgotten man meant more than all their symphonies of wealth. You never signed your intake form. The voice struck like cold water across the back of his neck. Thomas didn't turn immediately. He remained seated at the piano, letting his hands linger over the final chord of the morning's improvisation. The notes hung in the air, almost defiant, as if resisting the voice that threatened to silence them. I did, he replied softly, still not looking back. Page 2, bottom right. Gray Thomas. Not your legal name. He turned now slowly. The director of Golden Hills stood in the doorway like a judge in a black suit, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a flat line that had likely scared interns and volunteers into quitting. Thomas gave a faint, unreadable smile. Some people change their names when they change their lives. You falsified information to gain access to this facility. I paid in full, monthly, never missed a charge. The director stepped forward, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You are Thomas Grayson, billionaire, tech founder, philanthropist. You bought a penthouse on Fifth Avenue for your dog once. Exaggerated, he murmured. It was a brownstone, and she preferred the garden. She didn't laugh. You violated multiple policies. If corporate knew, they already do. She blinked. He looked back at the piano. And you're welcome. There was a long silence. I've had 4 reporters call today, she said at last. Her voice strained now with something deeper, fear or awe. They want interviews. They want photos. They want to know what you're doing here. One of them's threatening to bring a drone. Then I suggest you call the local precinct, he said calmly, before they mistake your garden for a helipad. I'm not joking, Mr. Grayson. I'm not either. Her hands clenched the clipboard tighter. You can't just walk into a facility like this pretending to be someone else. I didn't pretend. His voice softened. I just stopped being who I was. A pause. I'm trying to do something here. Something real. Something human. She stared at him. Her eyes, once steely, began to show the edges of unease. Not because she was losing control, but because control itself was slipping into something unmeasurable. This place, she said quietly, is fragile. If word gets out. It already did. And instead of breaking it, it's waking it up. He stood gently, closing the piano lid with reverence. I didn't come here to fix them, he said. They're fixing me. He walked past her without waiting for approval. That afternoon, something strange happened. Families began arriving. One by one, daughters, sons, and grandchildren of the residents came through the doors, not for birthdays, not for holidays, not for forced visits, but because they'd seen something. A moment. A song. A ripple in their memory of these people they thought had faded. Earl's grandson brought a trumpet. Helen's granddaughter brought her violin. Even the janitor's niece brought a drum pad and a hesitant smile. And for the first time in years, the common room didn't feel like a holding pen. It felt like a theater. Music echoed through the halls all afternoon. Not professional, not polished, just alive. Miriam sat in the corner sketching melodies on scraps of sheet music, her hand shaking but determined. Thomas moved among them quietly, listening, encouraging. He no longer needed to lead. The music was leading now. But in the office down the hall, the director stared at her monitor, her inbox exploding with media requests and corporate memos laced with panic, and one message sat flagged and unopened. Subject: Potential policy breach, immediate administrative review requested. She clicked it once, read it twice, and picked up the phone. Outside, the sky had gone pale with sunset. Orange bled into lavender along the edges of the horizon. In the garden, Thomas sat on the crooked bench beneath the birch trees, tuning a stringed kalimba a nurse had found in storage. The sound it made was tiny crystalline, like stars chiming. He didn't hear the footsteps until Evelyn sat beside him. "She remembers my name again," she whispered. He looked up, surprised. "She said it yesterday. Just looked at me and said Evelyn, like it was the most natural thing in the world." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, then smiled. "That's a strong name. Hard to forget. She told me she's been dreaming in music. She sees colors now, like she used to." Evelyn swallowed. "I don't know what you did, Mr. Grayson, but thank you." He nodded, thoughtful. "She did it herself," he said. "I just held the melody until she was ready to return." A soft breeze rustled the branches above. "She used to play for me when I had nightmares," Evelyn murmured. "I was 5. She'd sit at the piano, and the moment she started, everything faded. My fear, the dark, the monsters, all gone." "She still plays," Thomas said gently. "Just in other ways." They sat in silence for a while, the kalimba ringing quietly between them. Inside, the director stood before the staff clipboard pressed to her chest like armor. "Mr. Grayson is to be treated like any other resident," she said. "No questions, no posts, no photos, no interviews." A few nurses exchanged glances. One brave aide asked, "Why are you scared of something that's helping everyone?" The director didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the piano, placed a sign on it. "Out of order." Later that night, Thomas returned to the common room to find the piano taped shut with yellow maintenance paper. He stared at it for a long time. Then, without a word, he turned and walked down the hallway to the storage room. He found a folding chair, a bucket, and the kalimba. He carried them to the center of the hallway and began to play. Residents opened their doors. Some sat in their thresholds listening. Some came forward and sat on the floor. Others just closed their eyes and let the tiny notes wash over them like falling stars. The piano was silent, but the music had already escaped. It was everywhere now. The hallway smelled like citrus cleaner and defiance. Thomas sat on a folded chair just outside room 104, plucking soft crystalline notes from the kalimba that rested in his hands. The notes were small, no louder than raindrops on windows, but they carried. They moved. They reached into the rooms where residents once lay numb and stirred something ancient in the chest. One by one, doors opened. Some residents leaned out. Others shuffled forward, wrapped in blankets. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. They just listened. The piano was still silent in the common room, a cruel sign taped across its fallboard like a muzzle out of order. But music doesn't wait for permission. Thomas played anyway. At the end of the hall, Miriam sat in her wheelchair scribbling notations on the back of an old cafeteria menu. Her pencil was dull, her script jagged, but the melody was alive. It poured out of her like memory, one broken note at a time. Evelyn sat beside her, humming softly. "I don't understand why they taped it up," she whispered. Miriam didn't look up. "They don't fear the man. They fear the change." Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds broke into soft amber strips above the roofline, letting in a slant of golden light that cut across the hallway floor like a spotlight from heaven. That was when Helen began to sing. No warning, no music, just a voice, soft, raspy, but clear. It was a hymn, old, familiar, the kind mothers once sang in kitchens while drying plates. Thomas stopped playing. Everyone turned to her. She stood slowly, holding the wall for balance. Her voice grew stronger. Then Earl joined in, then another, until the hallway was no longer a hallway. It was a sanctuary. One nurse stepped out of the staff room and froze. Another lowered her clipboard and simply watched. Thomas didn't direct it. He didn't need to. He just let it rise, and when the song faded, no one clapped. They just sat, in it breathing. The silence afterward was sacred. That night, the director sent another email to corporate. This one short, clipped. "Please advise. Situation evolving. Staff participation increasing." She didn't know what else to say. How do you explain a riot made of harmony? A rebellion whispered instead of shouted. She closed her laptop and sat in the dark office long after the lights in the halls went out. Meanwhile, in room 3B, Thomas sat with his notebook open and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He stared at an unfinished score for a long time, then wrote a single title at the top, Room by Room. It was a symphony built not on tempo, but on stories. Each movement belonged to a resident. Each key change traced their past. It wasn't a song he planned to play alone. The next morning, the tape on the piano was gone. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. And beside it, a note in neat handwriting. "Use it before they change their minds. J." Thomas smiled. He knew the janitor's penmanship anywhere. At 10 a.m., he rolled the piano toward the middle of the common room. No one stopped him. The wheels creaked across the tile like it too was waking from a long sleep. He propped open the fallboard, tapped a key. It rang true. He turned to Miriam, who had already wheeled herself into place beside him with a small stack of pages balanced in her lap. "Ready?" he asked. She looked at the room. It was full. Residents, staff, family, a few children sitting cross-legged on the floor with wide eyes. Miriam raised an eyebrow. "As I'll ever be." Thomas nodded, placed her new composition on the stand, and began. This was no soft prelude. It opened bold chords, rising like a bell tolling over a sleeping town, then down into warmth, then up again, wild and joyful. It was Miriam's story told in notes, girlhood and grief, courtship, and silence, memory, and reawakening. Thomas didn't lead. He followed. She had written the map. He just traced it. The room leaned forward. By the second page, Evelyn stood at the edge of the circle, one hand over her mouth. By the third, Helen tapped her cane in time. By the final page, no one was the same. As the last chord faded, Miriam looked up, tears on her cheeks, but a smile that could break stone. "I remember it all now," she said quietly. Applause broke like thunder. No one told them to be quiet. No one hushed them. A nurse recorded again, this time openly. The video would go viral before sundown. By that evening, it had 1 million views. One comment pinned at the top read, "He didn't just fix the piano. He rewrote the way we see the forgotten." Back in the office, the director received another call. This time not from corporate, from the board of donors, and from a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Ms. Caldwell," came the voice. Low, measured. "This is Franklin Miller, chairman of the Harmony Foundation. We saw your piano video." She straightened. "Yes, sir. We want to fund a program at your facility." "I beg your pardon?" "We believe in what we saw. We believe in him, and we believe in her. Tell Mr. Grayson he has our full support. We're sending a donation tomorrow. 7 figures. The line clicked. She sat in stunned silence. That night, Thomas returned to his room where a single envelope had been slipped under his door. It read only, "It's time to decide. Stay hidden or stand seen. L." He turned it over. Inside was a printout of an article. Headline, "Thomas Grayson resurfaces as nursing home pianist, music memory, and miracles." Below it, his face, his name, his truth. He stared at it, then looked at the piano down the hall, then the open door to Miriam's room where she was humming softly while writing another melody. He picked up the envelope, walked slowly to the window, and tore the article in half, not out of shame, but because he already knew his answer. No one noticed when Miriam stood up. Not at first. It was during a quiet rehearsal for the upcoming spring room recital, as the residents jokingly called it. Thomas at the piano, Earl tapping out rhythms on the edge of a plastic tray, and Helen reading a poem she'd scribbled that morning about rain on linoleum. The room wasn't crowded. A few aides, a couple family members, people in wheelchairs, others propped on walkers. Background noise hummed from a nearby TV tuned to a game show no one watched. But somewhere in the middle of that soft, ordinary moment, something extraordinary happened. Miriam rose. She pushed back from her wheelchair, bracing herself on the piano like a woman testing gravity for the first time in years. Her arms trembled. Her knees nearly buckled. Thomas didn't see her at first. He was too deep into the melody, shaping it gently like clay in his hands. But Evelyn saw. She dropped her cup. The plastic clatter turned every head. And there she was. Miriam Linley, standing upright, clutching the piano with her fingers white at the knuckles, her face glowing with terror and triumph. No one breathed. Evelyn stepped forward, but stopped when Miriam lifted her hand and shook her head, just once. "I remember," Miriam whispered, "how it felt." Her voice, quiet but clear, slipped through the room like morning light. And then she did something no one could have expected. She began to sing. Not just hum, not mumble, but truly sing. A lullaby, maybe, or something she'd once written herself. The tune rose shakily, unpolished, but filled with something bigger than pitch or rhythm. The notes curved through the space like a ribbon in wind. Thomas's fingers instinctively matched her key. He shifted chords following her lead. She closed her eyes and kept going. Halfway through, she reached out. Evelyn rushed forward and braced her mother's arm, but Miriam didn't collapse. She simply leaned, smiling through tears. And when the last note fell, silence clung to the room like reverence. Then came the sound of someone weeping. Then applause. wild, unrestrained breaking from every mouth and hand that could offer it. A staff member had recorded it. By the time dinner trays arrived, the video had already been shared across 5 major accounts. By midnight, it hit 3 million views. The comments came in waves. This broke me. I'm a music therapist. This is why we fight. I can't believe I ever forgot my grandfather like this. She stood. My God, she stood. But one comment stood out more than the rest. It was from Lena. That's the woman he talked about when I was a little girl. The music teacher who changed his life. I didn't believe she was real. But here she is. And here he is. Playing again. Together. The post exploded. That night Thomas sat by himself in the garden. The air was cool, laced with magnolia and memory. The moon was high, so clear it felt close enough to touch. He wasn't hiding anymore. But he wasn't stepping into the spotlight either. He was simply being. His phone buzzed. A text. Lena. They know now. But this time they're listening. Really listening. Want me to come? He stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Thomas. Not yet. Let me give them everything I couldn't give you. He set the phone down and closed his eyes. In the distance, someone was playing his melody on a glockenspiel. Probably one of the grandkids visiting. It was a little off-key, slightly behind tempo. Perfect. The next morning, the local news arrived. Then national. Cameras set up just outside the main entrance. They weren't allowed inside. But it didn't matter. The residents came out. In chairs on walkers, wrapped in shawls with sun hats and memory in their eyes. And Thomas. He rolled out the piano himself, down the corridor, through the front door, onto the cracked patio stones that faced the small courtyard. He didn't say a word. He sat and began to play. No introduction, no press release. Just music, a new song. Something warm and wide like a sunrise. It had the bones of jazz but the skin of a hymn. No title, just truth. Miriam sat beside him, not in a wheelchair but in a garden chair, her hands folded in her lap, eyes forward, singing without voice. Helen clapped softly along. Earl tapped his shoe. Someone brought out lemonade. Reporters didn't ask questions. They cried and filmed and wrote the kinds of headlines they rarely got to write anymore. Miracle at Golden Hills. Billionaire plays for the forgotten. A nursing home finds its voice. Inside the building, the director stood at her window. She wasn't angry anymore. Only quiet. Only still. She picked up the phone. Send them the proposal, she said to her assistant. Tell the foundation we accept. Tell them we're ready. Ready for what? For more than funding, for transformation, for the beginning of a new kind of care, one shaped not by charts and medication schedules, but by song, by story, by dignity. That evening, Miriam came to Thomas's room with a new sheet of music. Her handwriting was stronger. She had titled it, For the Girl He Never Forgot. He looked up from the piano bench. Who's it for? He asked. Miriam smiled. For your daughter. She'll hear it one day. He nodded, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. I want her to. Outside, children played on the sidewalk. The wind turned pages of old sheet music left near the piano stand. Laughter echoed. The door was open, and for the first time in a very long time it felt like the world wasn't watching with curiosity. It was watching with hope. The folding chairs were mismatched. Some were metal, some plastic, and a few were old dining room seats dragged from storage. They didn't match, but they were full. The courtyard outside Golden Hills had never held so many people. Staff, residents, neighbors, volunteers, curious strangers, and a growing crowd of journalists formed a semicircle under the warm spring sky. At the center sat the upright piano, now polished to a soft gleam, flanked by 2 wooden planters filled with marigolds. A makeshift sign dangled from the patio overhang, Golden Hills Spring Recital, a concert for memory. Thomas stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching it all with quiet disbelief. He hadn't orchestrated this. It had unfolded like a tide pulled by something deeper than him. Music had passed from his hands into theirs, and now they carried it like torches. Miriam walked without her wheelchair now. Slowly, but without hesitation. She clutched a rolled-up scroll of sheet music in her hand like a sacred relic. Evelyn stood beside her, misty-eyed and still amazed. "Your mother wrote the opening piece," Thomas said. "I know," Evelyn whispered. "She barely sleeps anymore. She's always writing, always humming." He smiled faintly. "She's not writing music. She's writing herself back into the world." The director approached her posture more relaxed than anyone had ever seen it. She carried a clipboard, but it now looked like a prop. "We received another grant this morning," she said, glancing at Thomas. "Anonymous donor, $700,000. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Imagine that." She cleared her throat. "They're asking for one thing in return." "What's that?" "That we keep doing exactly what we're doing." A smile cracked her usually tense face. Thomas nodded slowly. "Then let's give them a reason." At precisely 2 p.m. the concert began. No stage, no spotlight. Just people in lawn chairs surrounded by blooming flowers, birdsong, and the buzz of distant traffic, and in the middle music that felt like memory waking up. Miriam played first. She walked to the piano slowly, hands trembling slightly as she sat. But when her fingers touched the keys, all doubt vanished. The piece she played was called April Remembers. It wasn't complicated, no flourishes, no tricks. But it was beautiful, honest. The kind of melody that could sit beside someone dying, or someone just born and say, "You're not alone." When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Next came Helen reciting a poem called Porch Light. Her voice cracked, but her message didn't. It was about the light we leave on for people long gone, and how sometimes they find their way back. Then Earl, with his grandson backing him up on the trumpet. Their duet wasn't smooth, but it was alive. A retired cellist who hadn't played in 20 years struggled through a Bach prelude. Halfway through, Thomas quietly joined him on piano. They finished together. And then finally came the moment no one expected. Miriam stood again. But this time she stepped forward, not with music, but with a microphone. She cleared her throat, then looked at Thomas. "This man," she said, "came here with nothing, no fame, no name, just a heart full of something most people spend a lifetime chasing and never find listening. Not just hearing, listening, to what we've lost, to who we used to be." She turned to the crowd. "We were quiet for a long time. Too long. Not because we had nothing left, but because no one thought to ask." A hush fell. Even the birds seemed to pause. But then one day, a man sat at a broken piano and played a single note. It was flat. It was hesitant, but it was heard. And from that note we began again. She looked at Thomas, tears lining her eyes. "Some people fix buildings, some fix systems. He fixed something inside us." Silence held the courtyard like sacred air. Thomas rose slowly, almost reluctantly. He approached the piano, eyes down, then turned to the crowd. "I didn't come here to be found," he said. "But somehow I was." He let that land. "My name is Thomas Grayson." Gasps moved through the crowd like wind. Yes, that Thomas Grayson. But forget that for now. He looked down at the piano. "I spent a lifetime building things to change the world. And then I disappeared. Because what I hadn't built, what I hadn't even begun, was something simple belonging." He sat. "This," he said, gesturing to the gathering, "is the most important thing I've ever helped create." Then he placed his fingers on the keys and began to play a new composition. He had finished it the night before. It had no title then. But now, as the music poured from the piano, Evelyn whispered it aloud from the front row, room by room. It started small, like someone humming down a hallway. Then it grew. Strings joined in. Someone's nephew on violin, a neighbor on cello. Then voices. Then clapping. By the final chorus, even the director was singing softly. When the last chord fell, the moment suspended in golden light. No one moved. It was the kind of stillness you only get after something sacred. Then came the applause, not polite, not obligatory, but roaring, a sound that rose over rooftops and shook the birds into flight. And in that sound lived every silenced song, every forgotten dream, every name that had slowly faded from family trees. It was all there, in the music, in them. As the crowd began to disperse, a reporter approached Thomas. "Why a nursing home?" she asked. "Why not Carnegie Hall?" He smiled. "Because Carnegie Hall has plenty of music," he said. "But here every note is a resurrection." The story was no longer just a story. It was a movement. By sunrise, the video had hit 20 million views. News vans lined the street outside Golden Hills like vultures, circling a battlefield, cables snaking across the sidewalk. Camera crews clutching umbrellas as spring rain drizzled steadily from a silver sky. The piano recital had become front-page material headlines about the billionaire who disappeared and found redemption, about miracles in a nursing home, about music reviving the lost. Thomas stared at the chaos from his window. It hadn't taken long. He had spent years vanishing, burying himself in simplicity, in silence, in the daily anonymity of mopping his own floors, and listening to voices most people ignored. But one melody, one moment of magic, and now the world had come knocking again. He turned away from the window and looked at the piano in the hallway. Someone had left a daisy on the keys. A simple thank you. In the common room, Miriam was already awake, sketching new chords onto the back of a crossword puzzle. Her hands were steadier now, her voice firmer. The music had rewired her from the inside out, but something in her eyes today felt different, like she knew what was coming. Thomas walked slowly down the hallway, nodding to a nurse who gave him a cautious smile. Whispers followed him now, not cruel, just curious. He entered the kitchen and found the director at the table with two men in suits. One of them stood when he walked in. "Mr. Grayson, I'm Agent Harrington, Department of Homeland Security. This is Agent Mays from the Federal Communications Commission." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Did I break the internet?" "No," Mays replied, "but you might have reprogrammed it." The director stood quickly. "They're not here because of anything illegal, I assure you. They just want to speak with you." Thomas folded his arms and nodded once. "Then let's speak." They didn't sit. "Sir, with your identity now public," Harrington began, "you should be aware that you're now considered a person of national economic influence." "That's a new one," Thomas said dryly. Maes continued. "The resurgence of your presence, particularly in a social services setting, has triggered interest from both advocacy groups and political organizations. Everyone wants to know what's your message." Thomas blinked slowly. "My message? Yes. Why here? Why now? Are you running a silent protest against institutional elder care? Are you launching a foundation, planning to speak at the UN? I sat at a broken piano," he said plainly, "and played a note." They stared at him. "And the people here," he went on, voice quiet but steady. "They listened. That's it. That's all. I'm not here to lead a movement. I'm here because someone needed to sing again." The agents exchanged glances. "Sir," Harrington said, "we're not here to accuse. We're here to protect. You've become a symbol overnight, and symbols attract storms." Thomas nodded. He knew. When they left, Miriam wheeled herself into the kitchen with a teacup balanced in one hand. "They'll never understand," she said gently. He smiled. "They're trying." She looked at him. "You ready to be a symbol again?" "I never was one," he replied. "They just made me one because I was too scared to say no." Miriam reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a folded note. She placed it in his palm. It was from Evelyn. She's writing a symphony. She won't call it that, but she is, and she wants you to finish it. His fingers tightened on the paper. That night, someone tried to sneak into the nursing home. A man with a camera whispering to himself was caught by the janitor near the south exit. He claimed he wanted to see the genius to film the next great content piece. Thomas heard about it the next morning and sat by the window for a long time. He didn't speak to anyone. He just stared at the piano. And then for the first time in weeks, he didn't play. Miriam noticed first, then Helen, then the rest. A quiet spread through the building like smoke. He was withdrawing. He was slipping away. But then came Lena. She arrived just before lunch. No press, no entourage, just her. Tall, poised, wearing a raincoat, and holding a tattered composition book in one hand. Thomas saw her from across the common room and froze. She walked to him slowly, deliberately, the air between them thick with things unsaid. Then, without a word, she sat beside him at the piano, opened the book, turned to a page he hadn't seen since she was 10. It was the lullaby he'd started for her and never finished. She placed it on the stand and looked at him. "Play it with me," she said. His fingers trembled, but he played. She joined in, tentative, offbeat, but brave, and the song came alive. Not perfect, not polished, but true. And when it ended, Thomas looked at her and whispered, "I'm sorry." Lena reached over and took his hand. "I know." Outside, the reporters waited. Inside, a father and daughter rewrote the ending of a song that had waited 2 decades to be heard. And somewhere down the hallway, Miriam whispered into Evelyn's ear, "He's not the story anymore. We are." The letter arrived 3 days later, sealed in cream-colored parchment, hand-delivered by a courier who didn't wait for a signature. It was addressed to Thomas Grayson, not Mr. Gray, not Resident 3B. And tucked inside wasn't just paper, but a request, a formal invitation to speak at the Global Summit for Social Renewal in Geneva. A billionaires' circle. Politicians, CEOs, royalty. They wanted him, not because of code, not because of innovation, but because a broken piano in a forgotten hallway had found its voice again and had sung to the world. Thomas folded the letter and slid it into the drawer beneath the piano alongside faded sheet music and napkins scribbled with lyrics. He didn't respond, not with words. Instead, he opened the fallboard and began to play. It was evening. Golden hills glowed softly under the honeyed light of dusk. Outside, daffodils trembled gently in a breeze. Inside, the building breathed like a living thing, warm, slow, attentive. The notes he played were unfamiliar. A new piece. Something gentle and full of space, like the hush that falls after good news. It wasn't showy. It wasn't meant to be remembered by millions. It was meant for the people down the hallway. For Miriam, who was now finishing full compositions each week. For Earl, who had begun teaching rhythm classes in the garden. For Helen, whose poetry club had grown so large they had to move it to the dining hall. For the ones who had been invisible. Not anymore. They called it the Echo Program now. Funded quietly by Thomas, by the Harmony Foundation, and by thousands of strangers who donated after hearing their story. It started with music. But it didn't stop there. Art, dance, writing, story circles, memory sessions set to soundtracks, grandchildren invited to join, volunteers trained to listen instead of instruct. And across the country, other nursing homes called, then hospitals, then foster centers. "How did you do it?" they asked. And the answer always was the same. "We listened." One morning, as spring tilted toward summer, Thomas stood on the roof. It was flat, unremarkable, meant for vents and pigeons, not humans. But someone had hauled a chair up there, and now it sat facing east, toward the horizon. He sat. From here he could see the city slowly waking, the glint of cars, the spire of a distant church, a water tower painted with graffiti that looked oddly like wings. Miriam joined him 10 minutes later. "You still haven't replied to Geneva?" she asked. He smiled. "No, and I won't." "You sure pretty glamorous. I hear they give you 5-star hotel shampoo and toast your name in champagne." He laughed low and warm. "Let them toast someone else," he said. "I've got a concert in room 212 this afternoon. Helen's premiering her poem cycle." Miriam sat beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out the newest copy of their collaborative piece, Room by Room Now, arranged for chamber ensemble, thanks to one of the visiting university students who had volunteered weekly since the first video went viral. She placed it on his lap. "We're sending this to the Juilliard archive," she said. He looked at her. "Whether you like it or not," she added. He didn't argue. Later that day in the courtyard, they held what would become their most intimate concert yet. No live streams, no press. Just candlelight hand-folded programs and the residents, their families, and staff gathered in a semicircle beneath strings of paper lanterns. Lena returned for it. Not as a visitor, not as a spectator, but as a musician. She played second piano alongside her father. The piece began with a whisper, a single repeated note, hesitant, fading into silence. Then the cello entered. Then the violin. Then voices, layered, uncertain, then bold. The lyrics were simple. "Remember me by what I built. Not towers, but the silence I filled. Not code, but the warmth I let bloom. Not cities. Room by room." By the final measure, there wasn't a dry eye left. Afterward, Lena sat with her father in the garden. "You could go back," she said quietly, "to your life. The board still talks about you. They'd give you the company, the platform, the voice." "I have a voice," he said. She nodded. "But people would listen. They already are." She looked at him, and in the dusk he seemed somehow both older and younger than ever before. "I hated you," she whispered. "I know. I wanted you to be someone else. I wanted to be someone else too." They didn't cry. They just sat there listening to the wind rustling through ivy and the faint sound of Miriam humming a new melody from her window. The world had seen Thomas Grayson disappear, and then it had seen him reappear, not in a press conference or a product launch, but in the gentle rise of an old melody played softly to a room of people who had been written off. And in doing so, he had built something no algorithm could replicate. A movement. A memory. A home. He kept playing. Not because he wanted to be seen, but because now others were being heard. And that was enough. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't begin in boardrooms or on stages. They begin with a single broken note played in silence. This story reminds us that greatness isn't just measured by wealth or titles, but by our willingness to listen, to care, and to show up for those the world has forgotten. Thomas Grayson had everything until he walked away from it all. But it wasn't until he stepped into obscurity, sat before a broken piano, and listened to the quiet voices around him that he truly changed lives, including his own. In a world obsessed with noise, this is a call to slow down and hear what matters. To remember that healing happens not through perfection, but through presence. To understand that even the smallest acts of humanity, of music, of memory, of dignity, can rewrite the fate of a place, a person, a generation. So don't wait for applause. Don't wait for permission. Start with one note and let the forgotten sing again.